Tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce someone who I suspect needs no introduction to many of you. Our speaker tonight is Serenella Linares, native of Puerto Rico and a mycologist amongst apparently many other duties as assigned with the Audubon Naturalist Society in Chevy Chase, Maryland. And as you're about to hear, she is one absolutely wonderful educator. And I, for one, can't wait to hear about the many fungal connections between mushrooms and the holiday season. So please join me in giving a very warm bienvenido to my amiga, Serenella Linares.
So thanks, Tom, for the invitation, and thank you, everybody, for coming to hang out with me tonight. I want to make the disclosure that I am a little bit animated and will love to have your interactions through the presentation. So if you have any questions or comments that you want to share with us, please use the chat box and I will do my very best to incorporate your questions throughout the presentation. So I also suspect that what I am discussing tonight is no surprise to any of you. I hope to catch the newbies and the aficionados who may not have heard some of these stories, but I hope that for all of you, it is at least fun. So join me in this adventure. So really the one mushroom that has percolated many cultures and many traditions is Amanita muscaria. As you probably heard here in the club before, it is a poisonous and psychoactive mushroom, but some of those poisonous toxins can be neutralized when the mushroom is dried and prepared correctly. In numerous cultures from Europe to Asia and Siberia, we can find evidence of this mushroom being used for religious practices and for spiritual purposes. Um, the earliest things that we can find about Amanita muscaria is that its evolution dates to the Pleistocene, and we are talking about 2.6 million years ago to about 11,700 years. So throughout the many repeated glaciations, the use of Amanita muscaria was spread through the old world, and eventually it enters Alaska. It enters the Americas through Alaska and it spreads southward from there. So the fruiting body of this fungus is mycorrhizal with birch and pine trees. And it's a proud member of the Wood Wide Web. And for those of you who have not heard that term, what it means is that network of rich mycelium that is connecting trees and fungi in the forest floor and aiding the conversations among plants, um, sometimes the warfare, and also the aid in case of emergency. And through this rich network, you can find different species. So one of them is Amanita muscaria. Now, when we look at the DNA of these species, we see that there is a difference between the old world Amanita muscaria and the species found here in the Americas. And the North American varieties have warts that instead of being white at first, they are yellow, but the exposure to sunlight quickly changes to white. So, what is the first incursion that Amanita muscaria does on our culture? Well, if we are talking about our life, if we're talking about my life, the very first time that you might have seen it was dancing in the movie Fantasia. So just like that, this little mushroom has started to trigger and spark the curiosity and really that creativity of many, many, many humans. And who will forget the appearance of the mushroom in Alice in Wonderland, where you have these magic mushrooms, hint, 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 that just by ingesting a little part of it can change Alice's size from little to big. So the main psychoactives that are present in Amanita muscaria are ibotenic acid and mucimol, which are mostly contained in the cap. Now, why are these compounds so able to alter our state? Well, it just happens that these compounds mimic the neurotransmitters in our brain, and it much like Gabe is commenting in the chat, they mimic that feeling of intoxication. As Gabe says it could be more of a hypnotic than psychedelic itself. So eating dry fly agaric um, can bring many symptoms depending on the person. Some of those are drowsiness, nausea, sweat, and hallucinations. And it can reduce the body's response to fear and stimulus. So I just want to say that I'm not endorsing that anybody uses these mushrooms. I'm just sharing with you that it has created some fantastic stories that has been passed from generation to generation. During the slides, you are also going to observe that some slides have links at the bottom. The slide deck is going to be available to you after the presentation. So if you want to learn more about the particular content of that slide, you'll be free to visit the link and read more information. So Now, if we take that Amanita muscaria and take it a little bit farther, you're gonna see that even Santa's outfit bears a little resemblance to what Amanita muscaria looks like. So here you have a character that has a bag of goodies, and it will have the clothing is red coloration, hint, 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 with white accent. I wonder what looks like that. So there are many reasons why to think that Santa's outfit has been inspired by Amanita muscaria. And there are many, as we see in the chat, I love all the interaction. There are many ways in which this mushroom has been linked to cultures. Some of them, the Kamchadals, oops, I'm sorry, and the Koryaks of Siberia. So we are talking pre-colonization of the Americas. And all these mushrooms end up being related. So it used to be that on the winter solstice, the Koryak shaman will gather several hallucinogenic mushrooms, um, among them Amanita muscaria, and then launch himself into a spiritual journey to the tree of life. In that particular culture, that tree of life was represented by a pine, which lived by the North Star and held the answer to all the village's problems from the previous year. So the shaman will ingest the mushroom to gain access to all that fountain of knowledge, which he will then gift to the village during the solstice. I wonder what happens during the solstice for us. Now, if we go even further back, we can see mushrooms being used as far, we can see evidence of mushrooms used as far as 9,000 BC in North African indigenous cultures. So these documentations, of course, are not on books or anything like that, but on the walls of caves. And I am bringing here some of those paintings that were found. So on the upper right corner, you're going to see mushrooms depicted in La Selva Pascuala, a cave in Spain. And you also have below individuals holding mushrooms in the cave in Tassili, Algeria. In that same cave, the shaman is depicted, and you can see a better representation of the photograph on the right bottom corner. The mushrooms are sprouting out of its shoulders and legs. So there's clearly that evidence that mushrooms have been used in spiritual rituals for many, many years. Now, that there's a recent molecular study that tell us that Amanita muscaria has its ancestral origins in the Siberian Beringian region during the Tertiary period. before it finally spread out through Asia, Europe, and North America. And I've seeded some of that here. So we also have this wonderful tradition of having ornaments in the trees. Well, guess what? That is also due to mushrooms in previous traditions. So if you were to do a search on where these things, where the decorating of mushrooms originated from, you're gonna find that supposedly it started in Germany in the 1600s, but we know better than that. We know that the Celtics and Vikings used to decorate their spaces and temples with evergreens. And we also know that the Romans celebrate Saturnalia or winter solstice. And like Celtics, they decorate the temples with evergreens. Now, add to that the fact that in preparation for the ceremonial trip, you have shamans that were hanging the mushrooms to dry on the trees, and to maintain that airflow and to be able to preserve those mushrooms. So if you add the pine with the mushrooms hanging, you have a beautiful Christmas trees in the modern time. And I want to say that Carla is sharing with us that sometimes squirrels hide catches of mushrooms in the trees as well. Thank you for sharing, Carla. So clearly, all those ornaments that we see might have been mushrooms in the past. So speaking about tree ornaments, there is a wonderful scientist that I think Tom has invited here for a talk in the past, right, Tom? Dr. Matt Casson from the West Virginia University and his lab are scientists that study fungal pathogens of cicadas, among other things. And last year, they were doing sort of a photo gathering of their own, looking for nature's tree ornaments in nature. So really what they were looking at were fungal or insects that came in the tree without people noticing until it was too late and they were already inside. So if you have any nature's tree ornaments to share, please feel free to tweet them. It's Casson _WBU, and the hashtag is nature's ornaments. I really love to follow them on Twitter. I learn a lot from the research posts that they do. So besides being tied to Christmas traditions and inciting all that creativity, a big part of the lore of mushrooms in our culture is tied to the fairies and the magic. Not just the magic that is hallucinogenic, but magic in general, of fairies and magical creatures. So we can see that in the in the names that mycologists choose sometimes to attribute to mushrooms and mushroom phenomena, very much like fairy rings, like crown fairy mushrooms and things like that. So attributed to mushrooms and fairies is that mischievous supernatural folklore in the fairy world. And some of that can be observed in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Dream. And I have here at the bottom a picture from the 1800s that depicts Puck the fairy, which is a very mischievous character, sitting on a toadstool and recalling that ceremony of fairies dancing around. And it really had a big association with mischief and things going awry. So there's a little bit of a video of A Midsummer Night's Dream right here for you.
I'm in the bank with wild time gloves. And with the juice of this, I'll streak her eyes and make her full of hateful fantasies.
I pray thee, gentle mortal, I love thee. What visions have I seen? Methought I was enamored of an ass.
There lies your love.
So yeah, the fairies and their parties. So we can witness here in Maryland some of that phenomena with the fairy rings. Right here, I have a picture of one fairy ring, but there are several species in our area that, given the right environment, are capable of doing or producing that phenomenon. So there's a legend that these fairy rings form in areas where fairies were performing their incantations and they were dancing. And Shakespeare believed that sheep will not graze on grass that was on the inside of fairy rings, as did many European writers. And that was supposedly because if you entered inside of a fairy ring, you were on their domain and they could control your behavior. So people tended to evade going in the inside of those structures. In Germany, these fairy rings are called Hexen rings, meaning Hexen, it's a witch. And instead of being ascribed to fairies, they were ascribed to witches performing rituals as well. In reality, thanks to modern science, we know that fairy rings are really forming at the edge of growing mycelium. On the right hand side, I have a GIF of how mycelium expands and grows radially on a petri dish. Um, so we know that mycelium is the body of that mushroom. And when the conditions are right, those mushrooms, which are the fruiting body, are going to form at the edge of that mycelium. And it The mycelium, given all the conditions are the same, are going to grow radially. If you see any deviations or any bumps on that fairy ring, those are due to changes in pockets in the soil. So if the nutrients are homogeneous, you're going to see a circle. If the nutrients are not homogeneous, or maybe the fairy ring has grown farther away than what your eye can see it, then you're going to see different shapes. And it's my favorite fact to know that the largest organism in the world was discovered because of one of these fairy rings. That largest organism is a fungus, is Armillaria ostoyae. Um, and it was discovered from U.S. Forest Service service via helicopter. They see these big rings of dying trees, and when they go to examine to the ground, they discover mushrooms all through that perimeter. When they did genetic analysis of all those mushrooms in the perimeter, they found that it was one single organism that was more than 2,000 years old, and it has 3.2 acres in area. So really awesome organism in the Malheur National Forest in Oregon. And what it is? A fairy ring. So continuing with the fairy theme, another gorgeous mushroom to catch with that fairy theme here in our area is Artomyces pyxidactus, or the crown tip coral. So it's widely distributed and it grows on woods from spring, summer, and fall. And who can forget the fairy cup lichens? They just look like wonderful green goblets that fairies forgot on the forest floor. The most perfect specimen that I have ever photographed was in the trail of Mason Neck Park in Virginia. And I have to admit that I threw myself in the floor and I blocked the trail to be able to photograph it because it was this tall. So I need to design a shirt that says, "Don't worry, I'm okay. I'm just photographing mushrooms," for every time I throw myself in the middle of a trail. But as my wonderful friends were talking earlier, these lichens are a symbiosis between anastomycete fungus, microalgae, and in many cases, yeast. So I already spoke to you about this wonderful fairy mushroom, Armillaria ostoyae, in the Malheur National Forest. And I forgot to tell you that this wonderful organism also is estimated to weigh 7,000 7,000 tons. So really big organism, especially considering that it can be microscopic. So while we're on the topic, we have to admit that next to the fascination that many people experience around fungus, there is a lot of fear. And that fear also accompanies and is reflected in the literature. So Percy Shelley in The Sensitive Plant in 1820 writes that agarics and fungi with mildew and mold started like a mist from the wet ground cold, pale, fleshy, as if the decayed dead with the spirit of growth had been animated. And Arthur Conan also writes, the fields were spotted with monstrous fungi of a size and color never matched before, scarlet and mauve, and liver and black. It was as if the sick earth had burst into foul pustules. Excuse me, but how rude. How dare you talk about my friends like that? So we know that the fungi are primary decomposers of cellulose in terrestrial ecosystems. But come on, that doesn't mean that they are deadly for the most part. So have a little love and spread a little love for fungi whenever you can. Of course, we need to be conscious about the poisonous mushrooms. I, for one, if there is an Amanita that I see, that's an Amanita that is pardoned. I do not mess with that genus. Thank you very much. But yeah, there are many other species that are quite benevolent. And if you give me a second, my computer is throwing a tantrum right now. Okay, share back. Here we go. All right. So there are many species that are benevolent, even when they look like fingers of dead people that are rising from the dead wood. They're just decomposers. So when the very first time that I spoke about this topic, the most intriguing story was the flying reindeer. We know that foxes and reindeer enjoy eating Amanita muscaria. So I will let this wonderful narration of how Amanita muscaria ends up being the cause of flying reindeer in our holiday tradition.
So, it's the holidays. And I'm thinking about mushrooms. Psychedelic mushrooms. The Amanita muscaria to be exact. Most commonly associated with fairies, gnomes, Alice in Wonderland, and Mario. So what does this magical mushroom have to do with Christmas?
It's surprising that it's taken so long for the popular imagination to encompass who Santa Claus is.
That's Carl Ruck, a scholar known for his work on the influential role hallucinogenic plants have played in mythology and religion. And he believes this mushroom may be one of the reasons we have flying reindeer and an all-knowing man who flies around the globe every winter. Maybe there's another story worth telling this season. One about a psychedelic mushroom eating shaman from the Arctic.
At least part of the Santa Claus image comes from Lapland.
And that's Lawrence Millman, writer and mycologist. He says the indigenous people of Lapland, known as the Sami, allegedly performed healing rituals led by shamans who used the hallucinogenic mushroom, the Amanita muscaria. So imagine it's winter, we're near the North Pole, and a shaman is coming to your house.
Long ago, the Sami people believed that the shaman who ate muscaria ended up looking like an Amanita muscaria. And he came on a reindeer-drawn sled,
So he had reindeer and he's looking like a
big fat person with red splotches in the dead of winter.
and instead of entering through the snow-blocked doorway, the shaman would drop down the chimney.
What they brought were not physical gifts, but usually healing and problem solving, which would be a kind of gift. And they were rewarded with lots of food.
Offerings of food, kind of like milk and cookies. Delicious.
And reindeer have a great love for mushrooms, and especially the males like Amanita muscaria. And one of the effects, I don't know if you've had Amanita muscaria, have you?
No, I haven't.
Not that I'm recommending it, mind you. One of the effects makes you feel like you're flying. And one can imagine that that's how reindeer feel as well.
So if we're imagining ourselves in the tent right now, there's a fire going, the shaman is in front of us, and the shaman
Would eat the mushroom, go into a trance, although they would be sitting there beating the drum in the tent. They would be saying, and I'm going down to the underworld, I'm getting advice from so-and-so.
So they would get advice from another realm and bring it back to the people, and
That would be the gift, as it were, of Santa Claus, i.e. the person who took the mushroom and ended up looking like the mushroom. This all becomes a kind of melange. You can't really interpret it with scientific objectiveness.
I should mention the Amanita muscaria is a highly toxic mushroom, but the urine from reindeer or someone who has consumed it is still highly psychoactive, but without all the toxins. In Siberia, people actually used to drink their shaman's urine to get the effects of the mushroom.
The shaman would eat the muscaria, then he'd urinate, and then his followers would get the urine and drink it. And then they would urinate, and their reindeer would follow them around, wanting to drink their urine.
So I'm not suggesting we start drinking Santa's urine, but what we've got here is a shaman from Lapland, which is near the North Pole, who rides a reindeer-drawn sled, enters people's houses through their chimney, eats red and white mushrooms, goes on a trip, and brings back gifts. And the reindeer love this same mushroom, which gives the sensation of flying. Maybe it's time we recognize that our all-knowing Santa, who travels the globe defying space and time, is actually a shaman. Lawrence, how much do you love Christmas?
I hate Christmas.
Well, what if we embraced this more shamanistic side of Santa? What would that look like?
What I would take away from it, the shaman comes as a healer or to give advice. We should think in terms of regarding Christmas not as a capitalistic holiday, but a time when one should think more spiritually about life, about one's ills, be they psychological or physical.
And you, Carl?
I mean, I think if you don't know the richness of our folkloric tradition, you are missing a large part of the opportunity you have to know who we are as a culture. And we should know what's going on with Santa Claus. It makes it more fun.
Maybe this Christmas we can make room for one more story. One about mushrooms, shamans, and ancient rituals. Maybe we should be asking Santa for something different this year. Something more in the tradition of his shaman forefathers, like time for reflection and looking inward.
This is the Amanita muscaria, like the nose on Rudolph.
So thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation. I actually downloaded this publication and I will make it available for you in the chat right now. Give me 1 second. Because it's a really nice read. So if you want to learn more about um, the lore about mushrooms, then this paper is certainly for you. So if you want to download it, I've put it in the chat for you. And I'm ready to entertain any questions that you might have.
Side note too, our our speaker last month, Greg Marley, he wrote a really good book, Chanterelle Dreams, Amanita Nightmares. And one of the chapters in this, he talks about the cultural anthropology of Amanita muscaria. It's a really good book to have, by the way.
I don't know if Serenella knows the answer to this, or maybe Mitch or someone else can chime in, but I did say in chat, I remember going to a presentation by Gary Linkoff where he talked about Amanita muscaria, and he had tried it. He got into mushrooms because of psychedelics in the first place. But when he tried Amanita muscaria, he was like, never again. That was a horrible experience. Lots of nausea and very little hallucination. But he speculated that the Amanita muscaria in Europe might actually be quite psychoactively different from Amanita muscaria in the US. And I don't know if, there's so many species that have been split over the last couple of decades where they've actually realized that what we have in North America is a completely separate species, sort of, DNA wise from what's in Europe. But I've never really followed the latest thinking on that whole set of questions specifically for Amanita muscaria. I don't know if anyone here has.
Yeah, when I was preparing for these, I saw the earlier papers that were saying that was the same, and then the most recent works first started referring it as a different strain from the one found in Europe, and I think now is being split as a separate species. But I can't remember exactly. But it's so much so that you can see that morphological difference between what the pure white muscaria is in Europe and the old world, which is from the very get-go pure white, whereas the one in North America starts yellowish and then turns to white. So there are some morphological differences that also correlate with genetic material, but beyond that, I can't remember much.
People chiming in the chat, Gabe saying that it may also have to do with when you harvest it, that people say you have to harvest it in August, that the goals can change throughout the year. Yeah, and Annie is saying that they have found true Amanita muscaria, like in the sense that it was originally named in Europe, that people have found it in New England. So, but that it was with an imported ornamental tree. So who knows?
Yeah, there's a lot of that. A lot of introductions in ornamentals, not just muscaria, but the more recent introduction that I can think of is Chlorophyllum molybdite was introduced to Puerto Rico via turf sales. And now has become invasive through the whole island. So yeah, that's quite common.
Sheila's asking, do the mushrooms grow during winter solstice? And I'm assuming that they are not up when there's snow on the ground, that it's mushrooms that were harvested earlier in the year.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, here Amanita season is like August, right? August, September, and up there it's even colder. So and someone asked, have you heard about temporary paralysis?
Oh no, I haven't heard that. I have to admit that the only incursion to the psychoactive world that I have done is the research for this presentation. So William is probably better prepared to answer that question than I am.
And John Harper went to a presentation at Telluride, which has lots of psychedelic aficionados at that festival, I hear. So someone who is experienced with Amanita muscaria, and her view was that the Eastern Amanita gassawii, is that how you say it, was just as psychoactive as the red Amanita muscaria in the Midwest and West, right? Because we get sort of a more orange Amanita with white spot.
Yeah, but you know, the same way that we harvest mushrooms, dry them, and then have them for the rest of the year, given the right conditions and abundant harvest, might have been what people were doing before the invention of refrigeration.
Yeah, Annie's correcting me that they were up here a couple weeks ago still. So so I guess they do go into the cold weather, although this has been a warm fall. But yeah,
I mean, you always see them. There has to be some type of variation and link to that spread, although I don't know how far into the solstice the Amanita muscaria appears on the Europe side of the world, but you always see them in depictions during Christmas time. If you look at illustrations, at very old illustrations, you're gonna find gnomes and Amanita muscaria and fairies being drawn and depicted in Christmas season.
yeah, and Annie's saying maybe it's because they're evergreen associates, and so like if they're getting their carbon from the photosynthesizing trees, that's hypothetically possible any time of the year on evergreens, right?
But if they're fairies and gnomes in the drawing, I would suggest that it's probably phantasmagorical anyway. So that just the area has nothing to do with reality.
But Annie's saying, you know, that Suillus is mycorrhizal with evergreens, and it can pop up in December. So who knows? We'll have to keep an eye out.
Yep.
That's another great thing Annie mentioned in one of her other comments. You know, you can look at iNaturalist for observations about some of these things, and you can get a sense of iNaturalist has those great charts of when things have been reported throughout the year.
That is.
This is actually correct. A knowable question.
Yes.
Yeah, so Annie actually has one that she found December 4th that she 22 years ago for the Amanita muscaria gassawii that we get here on the East Coast. That's the yellower version of Amanita muscaria.
Yeah, there are. Let me go. I was looking at the ones for today. California. Yeah, the Amanita muscaria variety Wesowi. This is one of the most recent observations in September. But California is seeing them right now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a great question. Thank you, whoever asked it. Thank you. All right. Thank you so very much.
So I again will repeat the thank yous to all of the speakers tonight. Tom for photos, Elizabeth for the wonderful snowflake efforts, and Serenella for, I would say, season's greetings. A fungal season's greetings is probably as best it could be done, from Fantasia to that very bizarre discussion of shamans, but well, I appreciated by all, I'm sure.